Under the harsh lights of a Senate showdown, Jasmine Crockett, the fierce voice for America's forgotten, faces Mitch McConnell, the 40-year titan of conservative power. With 27 million uninsured Americans watching, one bill threatens to decide, is healthcare a right or a luxury? McConnell defends private insurance, but Jasmine fires back with undeniable proof of corporate corruption and inequality. The chamber gasps. The balance tips. As the truth erupts, who gets saved and who stays forgotten? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett, a young congresswoman from Texas, was on a mission to overhaul the nation's healthcare system and safeguard the rights of low-income families and minority communities. Her meteoric rise began with a special election victory built on a bold campaign for healthcare equity, cementing her status as one of the Democratic Party's brightest new voices. "We cannot turn a blind eye to the injustice in our healthcare system," she declared, speaking for those long forgotten by a system in crisis. Opposite her stood Mitch McConnell, the veteran Republican leader renowned for championing free market principles and blocking sweeping reforms such as Medicare for all. "Healthcare belongs to the free market, not the government," he insisted, backed by the power of major insurance companies and private healthcare interests. The Senate was primed for a fierce confrontation as McConnell and Crockett, two figures with irreconcilable visions, prepared to battle over the future of American healthcare. This was no ordinary policy debate. It was a defining clash over the nation's path forward. The Senate was primed for a fierce confrontation as McConnell and Crockett, two figures with irreconcilable visions, prepared to battle over the future of American healthcare. This was no ordinary policy debate. It was a defining clash over the nation's path forward. The room settled into a tense stillness as McConnell leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk, eyes sweeping the chamber before locking on his colleagues. "Let's talk about choice," he began, his voice firm and deliberate. "Private insurance isn't the villain here. It's the lifeline. It gives Americans the power to decide how, where, and with whom they get their care, without being trapped in the grinding gears of government bureaucracy. Once the government takes over, that freedom is gone, and it won't come back." He tapped a folder in front of him for emphasis. "Look at companies like Blue Cross Blue Shield and United Healthcare. They've poured billions into improving technology, speeding up service, and expanding care for millions of people. These aren't just businesses. They're the engines driving our healthcare forward, and tearing them down would be reckless beyond measure." The Senate chamber was steeped in tension, the kind that made every shift in a chair or shuffle of papers sound like a crack in the air. McConnell, steady as stone, wasn't about to let his argument lose momentum. He had opened with the promise of choice through private insurance, but now he pivoted with deliberate precision to a different battlefield, one where public healthcare had already been tested and, in his telling, had failed. His eyes narrowed as he adjusted the microphone, the faint hum of the speakers filling the silent chamber. "Let me remind you of countries that already have these systems in place," he began, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he'd been preparing this moment for years. The room leaned in. "Take the United Kingdom, for example. They have a national health service, an admirable idea, healthcare for all, without the burden of private insurance. But despite the good intentions, they're facing crisis-level problems." He paused, letting the words crisis level hang just long enough to draw a few frowns from across the aisle. Then he delivered the number like a blow. "Right now, over 4.7 million people are waiting for treatment in the NHS system. That's millions of lives in limbo, unable to access the care they need in a timely manner." The impact of the figure rippled through the room. 4.7 million wasn't just a statistic. McConnell made it sound like an ocean of forgotten patients. He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to pull every ear closer. "The backlog is staggering. It's not just a number, it's real people. And those people are paying the price for a system that simply can't keep up with demand." He let that image settle. Hospital corridors lined with patients, months of waiting turning into years, diagnoses delayed until too late. When he straightened again, his gaze was sharper, his tone slicing through the heavy air. "And it's not just the UK. Canada is facing similar issues, with wait times that are forcing citizens to seek private care, which undermines the very premise of a public healthcare system. His words were clipped now, each one a strike meant to leave a mark. This is the reality when government steps in to manage healthcare. The resources just aren't there. In that moment, McConnell wasn't just presenting an argument, he was laying down a warning and daring anyone in the room to prove him wrong. The chamber was still echoing with the weight of McConnell's critique of public healthcare systems, but he wasn't done. If dismantling the myth of government efficiency was one side of the coin, he now flipped it to reveal what he believed was the real force keeping healthcare alive in America: competition. He straightened in his chair, his hands clasped deliberately on the desk, and leaned in just enough for his voice to land like a direct hit. "Let's talk about competition," McConnell began, his tone shifting into something sharper, more commanding. The pause after those words was deliberate, pulling the room closer into his orbit. The beauty of a private insurance system is that it fosters competition. Competition leads to better service, better care, and ultimately, lower costs. He let the sentence hang for a beat, then his gaze cut toward the Democratic side, his expression a challenge in itself. When companies have to compete for your business, they improve their offerings. They streamline their services, enhance customer support, and find new ways to bring down premiums. Each word was measured, delivered with the confidence of a man who had made this argument 1,000 times and never lost his footing. McConnell leaned forward, one finger tapping lightly on the folder before him, as if marking each point. According to studies from the Health Policy Research Institute, competition among private insurers has driven service improvements across the board. Private companies are constantly innovating, pushing each other to offer better plans, lower prices, and more options for the American people. His voice grew stronger, conviction charging every syllable. He spoke of a marketplace that rewarded speed, efficiency, and adaptability, not because the government demanded it, but because survival depended on it. Then he delivered the line with the weight of finality. "This is how we get a healthcare system that works, not by shackling it to government control, but by unleashing the power of competition to bring down costs and improve service." He paused just long enough to make the silence feel like agreement, then added, "In a truly competitive market, everyone wins. Providers compete for patients, insurers compete for your premium dollars, and the result is a better system that benefits everyone, patients, families, and businesses alike." His gaze swept across the chamber, the corners of his mouth barely tightening before he closed with precision. That's the power of competition. That's the engine of innovation. And it's what makes the private market the best solution for healthcare in America. The tension in the room was palpable as Jasmine Crockett rose to her feet. McConnell had made his point, but now it was her turn. Her voice rang out with a clarity that sliced through the silence. She was calm, but there was an undeniable strength behind every word. "Let me make something clear," Jasmine began, her voice low but forceful. "Healthcare is not a choice. It is a basic human right." The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Those words, simple yet profound, echoed through the chamber. She stepped forward, the weight of her convictions settling heavily on her shoulders, as if the entire debate hinged on what she was about to say next. No one should have to choose between their health and their life savings. Healthcare is a right, not a privilege for the few. The impact of her words was immediate. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Jasmine stood tall, unwavering, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had just argued for a system that had forsaken so many. "The Constitution guarantees us the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," she continued, her voice steady, but carrying the full weight of history. "And that means a right to life-saving care when we need it most. We cannot ignore that. We cannot let the cost of health determine the value of life." She paused, allowing the room to digest her words. The silence was deafening, but Jasmine wasn't finished. She wasn't about to let anyone forget the very real human cost of the system they were defending. The stories of people left behind by this system are not abstract. They are real, and we cannot continue to look the other way. Jasmine's expression softened as she prepared to share one such story, but the raw emotion in her voice made it clear she was deeply affected by the injustice she was about to recount. "I want to share a story, one of many," she began. "It's about a single mother in Texas, fighting cancer. She had no insurance, no way to pay for the treatment she needed. So she made the impossible choice to stop her care, to give up on her own life, simply because the bills were too high. She let the moment sink in. The room had fallen deathly silent, no one daring to speak. Jasmine's eyes never wavered from the faces of her colleagues as she continued. This is not an isolated case. According to the American Medical Association, over 27 million Americans are uninsured, many of them working-class families, many of them minorities. Her words cut through the air like a sharp knife. This system leaves people to die in the shadows, ignored, cast aside because they can't afford the care that's rightfully theirs. Jasmine's voice was raw, the weight of the truth in every syllable. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for those who had no voice in this debate, the forgotten, the neglected. The system we have now only protects those with wealth, the ones who can afford insurance. But what about the rest? What about the people who work hard every day, but still can't make ends meet? Her words were no longer just an argument. They were a battle cry. Jasmine's tone grew stronger, more urgent, every word building with intensity. The CDC reports that the poor, and particularly people of color, suffer higher rates of illness. They're the ones left waiting for care, left to die because of a system that is built for the rich, not the people. Every word she spoke was like a punch to the gut. Jasmine wasn't asking for change. She was demanding it. The injustice of the system was undeniable, and she wasn't going to back down until it had been laid bare for everyone to see. She wasn't just fighting for policy change. She was fighting for the very soul of the nation. The chamber was charged with tension, the air thick with anticipation. McConnell had just dismantled the most pressing arguments of the opposition, but now he was ready to turn the tide with his financial argument, the one that would hit hardest. He leaned in, every inch of his posture demanding attention. His next words would carry the weight of not just numbers, but the very future of the nation's economy. Let's be clear about one thing. McConnell's voice sliced through the room like a razor. Increasing the budget for public health care would drive the national deficit to unsustainable levels. This isn't just about health care. It's about the future of our economy. The sharpness of his delivery made it impossible to ignore, as if he was speaking not just to the Senate, but to the very soul of the nation. According to reports from the Congressional Budget Office, expanding public health care will add hundreds of billions of dollars to the federal deficit in the coming years. This isn't speculation, it's a mathematical certainty. He paused, letting the reality of the figure settle in. His eyes scanned the room, daring anyone to challenge him. The numbers weren't a hypothetical, they were a looming threat. Every dollar you take from the federal budget to fund healthcare is one less dollar for education, defense, infrastructure, and the services Americans rely on every day. McConnell continued, his voice gaining momentum. How much longer do we expect to drain our national resources before we destroy the very things this country was built upon? The room was tense, but McConnell was just getting started. His voice grew even more insistent, cutting through the silence like a whip. We simply cannot afford to bankrupt our future for a system that has never been proven to deliver the results it promises. His words hung in the air like a warning shot, leaving the room silent in its wake. Shifting his tone, McConnell aimed his argument like a missile at the heart of public welfare programs. Programs that he claimed had failed to live up to their promises. Let's talk about the public welfare programs already in place. Programs like Medicaid, which are meant to help the poor and vulnerable. But what do we see? They aren't working. They haven't delivered on their promise. His voice rang with authority, his words sharp as glass. In fact, Medicaid has failed to reduce the number of uninsured, especially in Democratic-controlled states. We're still looking at millions of people without insurance, despite pouring billions into these programs. He wasn't pulling punches now. Every syllable had a purpose, every word strategically placed. Instead of solving the problem, these programs have only expanded the deficit and left millions behind. McConnell's gaze locked onto the faces of his adversaries. His eyes burned with a mixture of frustration and resolve. The system isn't working, and doubling down on it will only drag us deeper into debt. With each passing moment, McConnell's argument grew more forceful, more relentless. The public sector has proven time and again that it cannot effectively solve the problem. If we want real change, we need to turn to the private sector and allow competition to drive the solutions. His words echoed in the room, leaving no doubt in anyone's mind that this battle was far from over. He had made his case, and now it was up to the others to respond or remain silent. McConnell stood tall, his final words ringing like a challenge. The future of America is on the line, and if we're going to preserve the country's greatness, we cannot afford to let this system bankrupt us. The silence that followed felt heavy, thick with the weight of what was at stake. The tension in the room was unbearable, thick enough to cut with a knife. McConnell had made his case with all the experience and finesse of a seasoned politician, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to let it slide. She stood up, the weight of her resolve more powerful than any speech. She was done with playing nice, and now it was time for her truth. Her voice rang out, clear and steady, but with an intensity that demanded attention. "We need a system that works for everyone," she began, each word cutting through the thick air of the Senate chamber. Her gaze swept across the room, as if daring anyone to disagree. A public healthcare system won't just level the playing field. It will ensure that everyone, regardless of their income, has the right to healthcare. Because let's face it, healthcare is not a luxury, it's a necessity. She moved slightly forward, her eyes now locking onto her opponents, the ones who had built their careers defending the status quo. In this country, the rich get the best care, while the poor, they're left to fend for themselves, left with nothing but the scraps of a system that doesn't care about them. Her words felt like a slap in the face, and the room was silent, each person processing the truth she had just laid bare. Jasmine wasn't done yet. She stepped into her argument fully, unafraid to face the hardest truths. Look at the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. They've built public healthcare systems that don't just reduce costs. They make sure every single person, regardless of their financial status, has access to care. Her voice was unrelenting, as if carrying the voices of millions who had been ignored for too long. In those countries, healthcare is a right, not a privilege, and their systems work. They provide better care at lower costs, and they do it for everyone. So why can't we do the same here? The room was still, but Jasmine's presence seemed to electrify the air. She wasn't about to back down. She pressed forward, determined to make every person in that room face the reality of what they were defending. Healthcare should never be treated like a commodity, a product to be bought and sold for the highest bidder, she said, her voice rising with each word. When we allow healthcare to become just another market for insurance companies to exploit, we're putting human lives at risk. We're turning people into numbers, reducing them to nothing more than how much money they can pay. The room shifted, the faces around her tense, unsure of what would come next. We're talking about people, not policies. We're talking about human lives, not business models. Jasmine's eyes never wavered as she delivered the final blow. The World Health Organization reports that public healthcare systems worldwide reduce costs and promote social equity. These systems don't just focus on saving money, they focus on saving lives. And what is a better investment than that? She let the question hang in the air, letting it sink deep into the minds of everyone present. This isn't just about economics, it's about justice. It's about making sure that no one is left behind simply because they can't afford to pay for care. The weight of her words was like a heavy curtain falling over the room. Jasmine's voice didn't just fill the air, it occupied the space, challenging anyone who was still holding on to the belief that the current system was fair. The silence that followed wasn't one of uncertainty, it was the silence of truth. And Jasmine had spoken it loudly and without apology. The air in the chamber was thick with tension after Jasmine's powerful words, but she knew she had to push harder. The momentum was on her side, and now she was about to drop a bombshell that could shift the entire debate. With a swift motion, she grabbed a report from her desk. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the key to exposing the truth behind McConnell's narrative. The room went still, every eye fixed on her as she prepared to unveil the numbers that would back her up. "Let me share something with you," Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the quiet. The senators, already on edge, leaned in. A recent survey conducted by Pew Research Center, one of the most respected organizations in this country, found that 65% of Americans support healthcare reform and want a public healthcare system. The silence that followed was deafening. Her words had landed with surgical precision, and the weight of the statistic began to settle into the hearts and minds of everyone in the room. She let the number hang in the air like a challenge. This is not some fringe idea. This is not just a pipe dream. This is the will of the majority of the American people, Jasmine continued, her tone rising with the undeniable power of truth. The American people are speaking loud and clear. They want a system that works for them, not one that forces them to choose between a doctor's visit and paying the rent. McConnell's face tightened at the mention of the survey. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation flashing across his features. He had been waiting for this moment, and he knew it was coming. But he wasn't about to let it stand. He straightened in his seat, his voice cool but cutting as he responded. "Let's talk about that poll," he said, his tone dismissive. "It's nothing more than a result of political manipulation. It's not a true reflection of what the American people actually think. It's the product of well-funded campaigns and special interest groups pushing their own agenda." McConnell's words were precise, calculated, aimed at diminishing the credibility of the poll. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Jasmine, as if trying to cut through the very foundation of her argument. Surveys like this are designed to get the results they want. They don't consider the reality of what would happen if we tried to implement a system like this, he continued, his voice gaining strength. What the American people think in the heat of a campaign is one thing, but what's best for this country in the long term is what matters. And that's why we cannot afford to turn to government-run healthcare. Jasmine didn't flinch. She knew this was coming. McConnell would always try to discredit any evidence that didn't fit his narrative. But she was ready. She stood tall, her presence commanding as she shot back with the same unwavering confidence she had carried throughout the debate. "You can dismiss this survey all you want, Senator," she said, her words sharp as daggers. "But the fact remains that the American people are tired of being ignored. They're tired of a system that serves the rich and leaves the rest to suffer. They want real change, and they're not going to stop fighting for it." Jasmine's words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to disagree. The room was deathly silent now, the truth of her statement settling over the chamber. McConnell may have tried to dismiss the poll, but Jasmine had shown that the will of the people was undeniable. This was a fight for the future, and she wasn't about to back down. The chamber was thick with tension, every eye fixed on Jasmine as she took a step forward, determined to press her case further. The room, which had been on edge throughout the debate, seemed to hold its breath. She could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of what was at stake. The air crackled with anticipation as Jasmine prepared to expose the true reason McConnell was fighting so hard to maintain the current system. "Let's talk about the real reason we're having this debate," Jasmine's voice rang out, steady but laced with an undeniable edge. "Senator McConnell isn't here defending the free market. He's here defending the very companies that are profiting off the suffering of the American people. He is fighting for the insurance companies, the same corporations that are the ones draining the system dry." Her words hit the room like a thunderclap. The silence was suffocating. Jasmine wasn't pulling punches. She was going straight for the jugular. "You know, the reality is simple," she continued, locking eyes with McConnell. "You're standing here today arguing for a broken system because it benefits you. It benefits your donors. For years, you've been taking millions from these companies. You've built your entire career on their backing, all while telling us that the system works. But it doesn't. It's failing millions of Americans, and you're doing nothing to fix it." The tension in the room grew, and Jasmine's words cut deeper with every second. She wasn't just accusing him. She was laying bare the corruption that lay beneath the surface. "You can deny it all you want, Senator," she shot back, "but the truth is clear. You've taken millions from insurance companies to fuel your campaigns. You've let their money dictate the policies that hurt the very people you claim to represent. And you sit here defending a system that leaves the American people out in the cold because it makes you richer. That's the system you're fighting for. That's who you're really protecting." McConnell's expression was stone cold, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of frustration and defensiveness. He straightened in his chair, his hands gripping the desk in front of him as he prepared to rebut her, to try and regain control of the narrative. His voice came out smooth, practiced, as if he had anticipated this moment. "I'm here to defend the principles of a free market," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "The businesses that provide insurance are the backbone of our healthcare system. They drive innovation, they bring competition to the table, and they provide the services Americans need to stay healthy. Protecting these businesses is not just good for the market, it's good for the people." Jasmine was ready. She didn't flinch. "What you call competition, Senator, is nothing more than a rigged game," she fired back, her words sharp as knives. "What you're defending isn't choice, it's exploitation. It's a system where the rich get the best care and the rest of us get left behind. People are forced to pick between health care and paying their bills. That's not competition. That's corporate greed disguised as freedom." McConnell's eyes flashed, but Jasmine pressed on, her voice rising with each word, her passion unmistakable. "You sit there talking about innovation, but where is it for the people who can't afford your so-called market solutions? Innovation isn't about creating more ways for insurance companies to profit. It's about making sure everyone has access to care. You don't care about innovation, Senator. You care about keeping the money flowing into your pockets and into the pockets of your donors." The room had become a battleground. On one side, McConnell clung to his vision of free market ideals, and on the other, Jasmine laid bare the hypocrisy that fueled the very system he was defending. The stakes were clear now. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for healthcare reform, she was fighting to expose the truth about the power that kept the system broken. "If the free market is so wonderful," Jasmine challenged, her voice unwavering, "why are millions of people still uninsured? Why are they still dying because they can't afford the care they need? Your free market isn't saving lives, Senator. It's destroying them." Jasmine's words echoed through the chamber, leaving a silence in their wake. She had put McConnell on the defensive, and it was clear. This was no longer just a debate about healthcare. This was a fight for the soul of the nation, and Jasmine wasn't backing down. The room crackled with anticipation as McConnell finished his defense, but Jasmine was just getting started. The air seemed to thicken around her as she stood, her voice rising with undeniable strength. She wasn't just arguing policy anymore. She was calling out the injustice of a system that allowed the few to prosper while the many were left behind. Every word she spoke felt like a charge in the air, sharp, undeniable, and aimed directly at the heart of the system McConnell had spent his life protecting. "Let's talk about what the system really does," Jasmine began, her voice unwavering, piercing through the silence. "The system we have today doesn't serve the American people. It serves the wealthy. It serves the insurance companies. And it leaves millions of Americans, millions of families without access to the basic health care they need to survive." Her words hit like a thunderstrike, each syllable laced with truth, with the undeniable reality of a broken system. It's not just failing, it's rigged against the people who need it most. She didn't flinch as she dug deeper. Jasmine knew she had to make them see. This wasn't some distant, abstract issue. This was happening every day, in every community across the nation. The reports from the National Health Program say it all. Poor communities, people of color, they're dying at higher rates because they simply can't get the care they need. And you want to sit here and pretend that this is working? She paused, letting the raw reality of her words sink in. While the rich are getting the best treatment, the rest of us are left in the dust. That's not just unfair, it's immoral. The room had grown tense, the weight of her words sinking into the air like a storm about to break. But McConnell wasn't ready to concede. His expression remained as unreadable as ever, but Jasmine could see the shift. She could feel his walls start to crack under the pressure of truth. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the desk, preparing to strike back. She saw the frustration in his eyes. It was there, flickering just behind his calm exterior. Jasmine wasn't afraid. She could feel the energy in the room shift, but she wasn't going to let it go. "This isn't a political game for me," she said, her voice rising with urgency. "This is about lives, real people. People who are dying because they can't afford the treatment they need. How is that okay? How is that acceptable in a country that calls itself free?" The words fell from her lips like a challenge, daring anyone to try to justify the system she was tearing apart. McConnell's response came fast, almost too quickly. He leaned back, straightening in his chair, as if bracing himself for the next round. The government has no place in deciding what people should do with their health care, he countered, his voice cold, calculated. People should have the freedom to make their own choices. The government should not be the one to dictate who gets treatment and who doesn't. His defense came with the same old rhetoric, the free market, the self-made man, the notion that individuals should be left to their own devices. It was a familiar argument, one he had used countless times before. What you're proposing is government overreach, McConnell added, his tone firm, and it takes away the freedom of individuals to make decisions for themselves. The free market is what drives this nation. We cannot throw that away for the sake of a government-run system. Jasmine didn't bat an eye. She was used to hearing this. She had faced it countless times, but the truth was stronger than his words. The free market is what has failed us, Jasmine shot back, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. The free market is why millions of people are uninsured, why people are dying because they can't afford the care they need. That's not freedom. It's a system built to serve the wealthy and leave the rest of us in the cold. She stepped forward, her eyes locking onto McConnell's, and she let every ounce of her conviction flow into her next words. You sit here defending a system that profits off of people's suffering. But that's not freedom, Senator. That's oppression. And if that's what you're defending, then I'm not afraid to call it out for what it is. The chamber was still, the weight of her words hanging in the air like smoke. McConnell's face remained unchanged, but Jasmine knew the truth had struck home. The system wasn't just broken, it was corrupt, and the people who had the power to fix it were the ones profiting from its failure. She wasn't going to let them hide anymore. The air in the chamber had grown thick with anticipation. Jasmine had fought tirelessly, but now it was time to expose the undeniable truth. The hard evidence that would silence the doubters and change the course of the debate. She wasn't speaking from mere opinion anymore. She had the facts, the cold, hard proof that public health care wasn't just a dream, it was a proven reality. With a sharp movement, she reached for the documents she'd prepared, letting the weight of them settle in her hands before raising them for the room to see. Let's look beyond our own borders, Jasmine began, her voice commanding attention, echoing in the now silent room. Let's take a moment to examine countries that have already implemented successful public healthcare systems. Sweden, Finland. These nations have shown us that it is not only possible to provide healthcare for all, but they've done it while actually saving money. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. She wasn't just telling the room what could be done, she was showing them what had already been achieved. These countries are proof that it can be done, and done right. They've maintained high standards of care, they've reduced costs, and they've ensured that no one is left behind. She took a breath, turning the page of the report in her hand. The room was locked in, waiting for the next bombshell. Reports from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, have confirmed this time and again. The evidence is clear. Public healthcare systems in countries like Sweden and Finland are more cost-effective and deliver better healthcare outcomes than we've ever seen in this country. They don't just cut costs. They create a system where care is a right, not a privilege. Jasmine's eyes cut across the room, meeting McConnell's gaze, knowing he would try to discredit this evidence. This is not theory. This is a proven model, one that has been implemented successfully. If these countries can do it, why can't we? The silence in the room grew heavier. Jasmine's words had struck with such force, such precision, that it was impossible to ignore them. Her passion was palpable. The American people deserve more than what we're giving them right now, she continued, her voice rising with urgency. We can't keep pretending this system is working. We're watching people die because they can't afford care, while the insurance companies continue to rake in billions. The rest of the world is showing us that a better way is possible. It's time for us to stop standing in the way of progress and join the nations that have made it work. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room, focusing on McConnell and the others who had staunchly defended the status quo. Her voice grew even more resolute, unwavering. This is not just about healthcare. This is about what kind of country we want to be. It's about whether we're willing to let people continue to suffer while we protect a broken system. If we truly believe in the values this country was founded on, then we have a duty to act. We have a duty to reform the system and put the people first. Jasmine's words lingered in the room like a thunderclap. The weight of the evidence, combined with the passion in her voice, left no room for doubt. This was no longer just a political debate, it was a moral imperative. The stakes had never been higher. Jasmine had laid down the gauntlet, and the question was now clear. Would they continue to defend a system that left millions in the dark, or would they stand with the people and fight for real change? The Senate session ended, but the energy from the debate between Jasmine Crockett and Mitch McConnell reverberated far beyond the chamber's walls. The clash of ideologies, the heat of the argument, the power of their words, it was a moment that had not only captured the attention of those in the room, but the attention of an entire nation. The fight for healthcare reform was no longer just a political battle. It had become a moral one, a fight for the very soul of America's values. As the senators filed out of the room, their faces painted with uncertainty and resolve, Jasmine stayed behind for a moment longer. She knew this wasn't over. She had thrown down the gauntlet, and now the battle would continue on every front, in the media, in the streets, and most importantly, in the hearts of the American people. Outside the Senate, the media machinery sprang into full action. News outlets from across the country pounced on the story, dissecting every word spoken in the debate. Reporters were running interviews with political experts, healthcare activists, and even regular citizens who had watched the exchange live. But what stood out the most in all the coverage was the polarized response. Jasmine's words had struck a chord with many, while McConnell's defense of the status quo had only deepened the divide. The sharp lines drawn in the debate were now reflected in the nation's response. While McConnell clung to his defense of private insurance, a growing chorus of voices was rising in support of Jasmine's call for healthcare reform. Activists, civil rights organizations, and labor unions, long dissatisfied with the status quo, now saw an opportunity. This was more than just policy. It was a fight for fairness, for justice. This is the moment we've been waiting for, they declared. The system needs to change, and Jasmine Crockett is leading the charge. These words echoed across social media, in grassroots meetings, and on the steps of the Capitol. Jasmine had become not just a politician, but a symbol of the change that many had hoped for. The nation's reaction was swift and unmistakable. Social media platforms were flooded with hashtags supporting Jasmine, with citizens from every walk of life sharing stories of their struggles with healthcare. Long wait times, crippling medical bills, and the constant fear of being one illness away from a financial ruin. The voices of ordinary Americans became the backdrop to the growing movement. People who had once felt powerless were now joining the conversation, sharing their personal stories and demanding that their voices be heard. It wasn't just the public who were responding. Jasmine began to feel the momentum shift in the Senate. Her colleagues were watching, and while some still remained loyal to McConnell's vision, others were starting to waver. Some Democrats who had quietly hoped for a moment like this now found themselves emboldened by her words. Civil rights leaders and union heads, once thought to be outside the mainstream political conversation, were now standing shoulder to shoulder with Jasmine, offering her not just their endorsement, but their unwavering support. They understood what was at stake here. This wasn't just about healthcare, it was about power. The power to ensure that every American, no matter their race or income, had access to the care they needed to live. And then came the poll. It wasn't just a survey, it was the moment that could change everything. A day after the debate, the Pew Research Center released the results of a nationwide survey. The numbers were shocking. 58% of Americans now support Jasmine's call for healthcare reform, the results stated. It wasn't just a majority, it was a clear mandate. The people had spoken. They were tired of the current system. They wanted change. The numbers were more than just figures on a chart. They were a testament to the power of the moment, to the strength of Jasmine's message. She had tapped into something far deeper than politics. She had struck a nerve. Jasmine read the poll results, feeling the weight of them settle on her shoulders. 58% wasn't just a number, it was a movement. She had given voice to the millions who had been silenced for so long. The pressure to act was now undeniable. The public was demanding reform. The American people had made their stance clear, and Jasmine knew she couldn't let this opportunity slip away. She had to press forward. There was no turning back. The energy that had been building over the last few weeks now felt unstoppable. But McConnell, true to form, wasn't going to concede so easily. He had long known how to manipulate the narrative, how to keep the political machine working in his favor. And now, with his back against the wall, he shifted gears, launching into a public rebuttal of the poll results. In the hours following the survey's release, McConnell went on air to dismiss the numbers, calling them nothing more than the result of political campaigns and special interests. This poll doesn't reflect the true sentiment of the American people, McConnell declared in his usual calm, controlled tone. It's a result of targeted campaigning, funded by those pushing their own agendas. It was a classic move, a last-ditch effort to discredit any evidence that didn't fit his narrative. He couldn't afford to let the momentum slip away. But Jasmine wasn't backing down. She had seen this tactic before, and she wasn't going to let it go unchallenged. The next day, she appeared on national television, ready to respond. "The numbers don't lie, Senator," Jasmine said, her voice calm but firm. "You can dismiss the poll all you want, but the truth is clear. The American people are tired of being ignored. They want health care reform, and they want it now." The look in her eyes was fierce, unyielding. This isn't about political games. This is about people's lives. Jasmine's words cut through the noise echoing across news stations, social media, and in the streets. The public wasn't just waiting for a change, they were demanding it. And Jasmine, standing firm in the face of McConnell's rebuttal, became the symbol of that change. The tide was turning. And as the support for reform continued to grow, it became clear that the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about a healthcare system. It was about who held the power to determine the future of the nation. The battle wasn't over, but the people had spoken, and they were rallying behind Jasmine. The support from civil rights organizations, labor unions, and ordinary Americans gave her the strength to keep fighting. The Senate, the media, and the public were all watching. It was clear that Jasmine had emerged as the voice of the people, and now the question wasn't if change would happen, but when. The debate had concluded, but the reverberations of Jasmine's words continued to shake the very foundation of American politics. The Senate session was over, but the conversation had only just begun. It was no longer about abstract policy or theoretical frameworks. This was about people, real people, and the injustice that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Jasmine had thrown the gauntlet down, and the implications were undeniable. It wasn't just a debate over healthcare. It was a battle for the future of the nation. In the hours that followed, news outlets across the country buzzed with reaction. The initial shock of the confrontation was still fresh in the minds of millions. The media outlets ran the clips of the debate over and over, replaying every sharp exchange between Jasmine and McConnell. But it wasn't just the pundits who were talking. The public had been awakened in a way they hadn't been in years. What had once been a distant, impersonal issue was now personal to so many. Healthcare wasn't just a political debate anymore. It was a life-or-death issue for millions of Americans. As the hours passed, the debate between Jasmine and McConnell continued to dominate the airwaves. Yet it wasn't just the political elite or the media who were weighing in. The American people were talking too. On social media platforms, in coffee shops, at kitchen tables across the nation, people were having the conversation. Healthcare was no longer just an issue for politicians to bicker over. It was a conversation that had penetrated the hearts of every citizen. Jasmine's words had resonated deeply with the public, with many people who had been marginalized by the current system now finding their voices. They had seen firsthand the injustices that Jasmine had brought to light. They had lived it. Families had been torn apart by the overwhelming cost of healthcare, while others had been left to fend for themselves, unable to access the care they so desperately needed. For these people, Jasmine wasn't just a politician, she was a champion, a voice for the voiceless, someone who understood their pain and their struggles. But even more striking was the sudden wave of support from organizations and individuals who had long been on the front lines of fighting for social justice. Civil rights groups, labor unions, and healthcare advocates rallied around Jasmine, giving her the political backing she needed to press forward. These organizations had spent years advocating for the very reforms Jasmine was now calling for. But it had always been an uphill battle. Now, with the momentum building behind her, they saw an opening, a chance to finally bring about real change. They had been waiting for this moment, and now they were all in. The public response was swift, and it was powerful. Within hours of the debate's conclusion, polling firms began releasing data that would send shockwaves through the political establishment. The Pew Research Center, one of the most respected polling organizations in the country, published the results of a new survey just hours after the debate. The findings were clear. 58% of Americans support Jasmine's call for healthcare reform. The number wasn't just a statistic, it was a resounding endorsement of Jasmine's message. The American people were sick and tired of a broken system, and they were ready for change. Jasmine had delivered a message that resonated with the hearts of millions, and the survey results reflected that. 58% of Americans, the poll read. It was a mandate, not just for reform, but for justice. It was a call for a healthcare system that served all Americans, not just the wealthy. Jasmine could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. The people had spoken, and their voices were loud and clear. They were demanding change. But McConnell wasn't going to let the poll results define the conversation. As expected, he quickly dismissed the survey. He took to the airwaves, trying to downplay the significance of the findings, accusing the poll of being manipulated by political interests. This poll doesn't reflect the true sentiment of the American people, McConnell said in a televised interview. It's a result of targeted campaigning by groups with their own agendas. The truth is, the American people don't want government-run healthcare. They want the freedom to make their own choices. It was a predictable response, one that McConnell had used countless times to deflect the growing momentum behind healthcare reform. He was trying to spin the results to turn the narrative back in his favor. But Jasmine wasn't intimidated. She knew this was coming, and she was ready to face it head-on. The following day, Jasmine appeared on national television, ready to respond to McConnell's dismissal of the poll. "The numbers don't lie, Senator," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "The American people are tired of being ignored. They're tired of a system that leaves them behind. They're demanding healthcare reform, and they're not going to stop until they get it." She leaned in, her eyes piercing through the screen, as if speaking directly to every viewer watching at home. "You can try to dismiss the facts all you want, Senator," Jasmine continued. "But the truth is, the people have made their voices heard. They want change, and it's time for you to listen." Her words struck a chord. Social media erupted with support. People began sharing the clip of Jasmine's response, praising her for standing firm against McConnell's attempts to downplay the people's desire for change. The narrative was shifting in real time. The tide was turning, and Jasmine was leading the charge. In the weeks following the debate, the momentum for healthcare reform continued to build. What had once seemed like an uphill battle was now a full-fledged movement. Civil rights leaders, healthcare advocates, and ordinary Americans were now speaking out, joining the chorus of voices demanding a better healthcare system. The media, once hesitant to take a firm stance, now began to cover the issue with renewed intensity. Jasmine had sparked a national conversation, and the momentum was palpable. But as the public support for Jasmine's position grew, so did the pressure on lawmakers. Behind closed doors, some of McConnell's own colleagues began to question their long-standing defense of the current system. They were feeling the heat from their constituents, and the results of the poll made it clear that the political landscape was changing. The people were demanding healthcare reform, and it was only a matter of time before that demand would be impossible to ignore. The debate wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The question was no longer if healthcare reform would happen, but when, and Jasmine was determined to make sure it happened. The battle lines had been drawn, and she wasn't going to back down. The people had spoken. It was time for the Senate to listen. As the dust settled and the Senate halls emptied after the intense debate, Jasmine Crockett knew that the real work had only just begun. The fight for healthcare reform was far from over, but the conversations sparked by her words had already begun to take on a life of their own. Across the country, the American people were talking, not just about politics, but about what kind of nation they wanted to live in. The fight had shifted from a legislative struggle to a moral reckoning. Jasmine sat quietly in her office, reflecting on the weight of the debate. She had won the room, but victory in the Senate was never enough. The battle she was fighting was much bigger. This was a fight for justice, for the right to life and dignity for every American. The long-term impact wasn't just about a single bill or a policy shift. It was about the values that shaped the nation. What did it mean to be an American? Was healthcare a privilege for the few or a right for all? The voices of the people were now louder than ever. The social media storm, the rallies, the letters and phone calls flooding into congressional offices, it was all part of something bigger. This wasn't just a political debate. It was a call to action, a demand for change. The public had been pushed to the edge by a system that put profits over lives, and they weren't going to be silenced. Jasmine thought about the countless stories she had heard from families across the country. The mother who had to choose between cancer treatment and feeding her children. The father who had watched his child suffer because he couldn't afford the medication. These were the real costs of a broken system, the human toll that no politician could ignore. Jasmine had heard their cries, their stories of pain, and their pleas for help. And in those moments, it was clear to her, this wasn't just a policy issue. It was a question of morality. It wasn't just about healthcare. It was about how we, as a society, valued life, how we saw the dignity of every person, whether they were rich or poor, black or white, healthy or sick. Did the country stand for fairness? Did it stand for compassion? Or did it stand for a system that left the most vulnerable to fend for themselves while the rich thrived? Jasmine remembered one particular story. A woman, a single mother, had written to her after the debate. Her name was Maria, and she told Jasmine about her struggles with the healthcare system. Maria's child had been diagnosed with a rare illness, and without the right treatment, her child's condition would only worsen. But there was a problem. Maria didn't have insurance. She couldn't afford the treatments her child needed. The price was simply too high, and so she did the only thing she thought she could do. She watched her child suffer in silence. Maria's letter was a gut punch to Jasmine. The pain in her words was palpable. But what stuck with Jasmine was something Maria said at the end. I know my child deserves better. I know there's a way to fix this, but I don't know if I'll be alive long enough to see it. Jasmine felt the weight of those words, the grief, the helplessness. It wasn't just about a lack of health care. It was about a broken system that had stripped people like Maria of their dignity, their hope, their future. As Jasmine read the letter, it became clearer than ever. This fight wasn't just for policy change. It was for the future of the American dream. The dream that every person, no matter their background, would have the chance to live a healthy, fulfilling life. The dream that healthcare wouldn't be a battle of survival for the poor, but a right that everyone deserved. This was what was at stake, the very values that America claimed to stand for. The nation's foundation was built on the idea that all people were created equal, that they deserved life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if millions of Americans couldn't access healthcare, then how could they truly live? How could they pursue happiness if their health was at risk, if their children's health was at risk, just because they didn't have the money to pay for the care they needed? Jasmine knew that this was bigger than a debate. This was about the soul of America. And as she stood up to fight, she was not just fighting for a bill, but for every person who had been left behind by a system designed to benefit the few. She was fighting for Maria and her child. She was fighting for the working families who had been told to settle for less, to wait their turn, to accept that their suffering wasn't worth fixing. The lessons of this debate were clear. A just society doesn't leave its citizens to suffer because of their circumstances. A just society doesn't allow its people to fall through the cracks simply because they don't have the means to keep up. A just society doesn't value the health of its people less than the profits of its corporations. Jasmine knew the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but she was ready to face them. What Jasmine realized in those quiet moments was that this battle wasn't just about healthcare. It was about who we are as a country, the values we upheld, the priorities we set. If the system wasn't changed, the country would continue to fail the most vulnerable, continuing the cycle of inequality and injustice that had been allowed to fester for too long. But if the people rallied together, if they stood up for what was right, then change was possible. The future of healthcare was a reflection of the future of the nation itself. In those moments of reflection, Jasmine found not just resolve, but clarity. This wasn't just about politics. It was about the humanity that had been pushed aside for far too long, and it was time for that to change. She wasn't just fighting for a healthcare system, she was fighting for a society where every person's life mattered, where every life was worth saving. As she stood up from her desk, ready to face the next battle, Jasmine understood the deep human lesson that had emerged from this fight. It wasn't enough to just talk about change. True change came when the people stood up and demanded it, when they recognized the power they held in their voices, in their votes, and in their actions. The fight for healthcare wasn't just a fight for policy, it was a fight for justice, for dignity, for humanity. Jasmine's journey was only beginning, but she was no longer fighting alone. The American people were behind her, ready to take on the forces that had kept the system in place for so long. And with each step forward, Jasmine knew that they were moving closer to a future where every person, regardless of who they were or where they came from, would have the right to a healthy, fulfilling life. And that, Jasmine believed, was the greatest lesson of all, the lesson that would define not just this debate, but the future of the country. As the weight of the debate settled in the room, Jasmine knew it was time for action. The polls, the overwhelming public support, the voices of the people, it was all there. But now she had to translate that energy into real, tangible change. The stakes had never been higher. The people were demanding a new path forward, and it was time for the Senate to act, to stop sitting on the sidelines and start working for the people they swore to serve. Jasmine stood, her figure cutting through the room like a beacon of determination. This is not just about policy. This is about the future of every single American, she said, her voice rising with a strength that filled the chamber. We've heard the people's voices. We've seen the polls. We've felt the weight of this moment. Now it's time to act. She paused, looking around at the faces before her. Some were filled with uncertainty, others with opposition, but all of them were there for the same reason, because this moment demanded their response. We can no longer allow our healthcare system to be a privilege for the wealthy. While the rest of us are left to fend for ourselves, Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering. This isn't just a fight for a bill. This is a fight for the soul of this nation. This is a fight for fairness, a fight for justice, a fight for the future of the American people. The tension in the room grew thicker, but Jasmine pressed on, determined to make her point clear. We cannot sit idly by while millions of Americans continue to suffer. We cannot keep pretending that the system we have is working. The people have spoken. They want change. They deserve better. And if we, as their representatives, don't act, then we will be failing them. We will be failing every single person who has put their trust in us. Her words cut through the air, each one a call to action, a challenge to every senator present. This is the moment where we must decide what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to be a country where healthcare is a right for all, where no one is left behind? Or do we want to continue to prop up a broken system that benefits the few and leaves the rest of us to suffer? She paused, her gaze unwavering as it swept across the room. We cannot afford to wait any longer. The time for action is now. Jasmine's voice rang with finality. I am calling on every single one of you, regardless of party lines, to join me in this fight, to stand with the American people, to stand with the future. The people have made their voices heard. It is time for us to answer that call. It is time for us to make history. The room was silent, the gravity of her words hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. Jasmine had laid down the challenge. The people had spoken. And now it was time for the Senate to rise to the occasion. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.